carry me away, lift me from this place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. When I close my eyes, I can see your face, and an ocean of love washes over me, and I am in your presence. Carry me away, lift me from this place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. When I hear your voice, the power of your word, oceans of peace flood right through my heart. I live for you, and I embrace your holiness. Carry me away, lift me from this place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. Carry me away, lift me from this place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. My burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. Let me see your face, carry me away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another SDAQ&A. I'm your host for today, as always, Peter Dixon, and a former Adventist looking in from the outside. And my very special guest today is Professor David Geelan. How are you, David?
G'day, Peter. Yeah, going well, thanks.
It's so good to have you on the program. When I advertised that you were going to be on, a lot of people were like, we must see this, we must watch this. So you've made a splash in the social media realm, and people always enjoy following you and watching your comments in the various groups that you're in. First up, before we start, just a big apology for the over an hour delay start today. There was no problem at David's end. It's all my fault. So I apologize for that, everyone. Just some major computer issues and reboots and whatnot. So if there's a wealthy Adventist or former Adventist out there that would like to buy me a brand new computer, thank you. That would be wonderful. But look, we're going to be chatting today. This is not part of our 70s series. This is season 5, and we've been doing a lot of interviews with people that were involved in the 70s. David, you were quite young in the 70s, and
I was around and about, but not much theological debate in my.
But both of us, lived. I'm still in Cooranbong. You lived in Cooranbong for a long time, and have known you, ever since the early days, and it's been a pleasure to be able to call you a friend. So it's good to have you on the show. So in season 5, I've been talking to a lot of people that would call themselves former Adventists, and we're kind of discussing, different aspects of their story. You may or may not call yourself that. Yours is an interesting journey, and so we're not going to label you, but I thought it'd be interesting as a little bit of a teaser. I've called it From Adventism to PanENtheism, and I've put in capitals the E and the N because it's different to pantheism. PanENtheism is different. Pantheism, I can kind of understand. It's God is in everything kind of thing. But this is a bit different. So in a moment, I'll get you to kind of give your definition. In researching this, I've found that it's a very difficult term to define, and there's lots of debate out there in the world as to what does it actually mean. So we'll get you to unpack that a bit more. But Adventism has a bit of a link to pantheism, where the Living Temple was written by Kellogg, wasn't it? One of the Kellogg brothers. Was that around 1910 or 1900?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that to me, I think was the division of Ellen White and the Kellogg's. Basically, they'd been sort of working very closely on the health message and so on, but the Kellogg's basically ended up heading off into pantheism.
Yeah, different direction.
And yeah, that was the kind of the big split. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah, and apparently, and I'd need to research this because it's a long time since I looked into it, A.G. Daniels, I think, was the GC president of the church at the time, and apparently there'd been a bit of a lull in the sales of Ellen White's 2 big books at the time, Great Controversy and Desire of Ages, I think. I might be wrong with the Desire of Ages part, but anyway, apparently sales had been dipping, and Daniels was still, I can't remember which of the brothers it was, but he was still considered a bit of a golden boy in Adventism, and had been really popular with his writings and his hospitals, etc., and administration skills. And so he was encouraged to write this book, and they kind of felt it might be a way to really bring in extra funds. But of course, when it came out in A.G. Daniels, I think they wouldn't even release it. I think Kellogg had to release it separately because of this kind of what we'd call now a bit of a New Age approach to God. So that's a bit of a backstory for those who might want to dig deeper and find out in detail about that time period. But I would love to read that book. I haven't read it. I've tried to find it. If anyone's got a copy, I'm happy to buy it off you. The Living Temple. So that book kind of talks about God being in everything, and that's pantheism. Maybe you could tell us what's panentheism and how that relates to you and your journey with Adventism.
Sure, yeah. So I guess, traditional Christian theology basically talks about God as being immanent and transcendent. So immanent being in everything in the universe. God sort of interpenetrates the entire universe. There's no black spots where God isn't. So this idea of immanence and then transcendence. God is not the same thing as the universe, but is superior to the universe, right? So that's a very traditional Christian theology. I think pantheism says God is the universe. The two are the same thing, essentially. So God is throughout the universe, but the universe is God and God is the universe, and the two are identical. And so I think, that doesn't particularly appeal to a lot of people, but, I guess other people, maybe the Kellogg's, because they were thinking about science, about the body and the connection of the body to the living world and so on. The notion that God was the living world and the living world was God was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And there's some that say that to call the Living Temple book a pantheistic book is inaccurate, that it is actually more of a PanENtheism representative style of book.
Yeah, so I guess
that's why I want to read it to try and see it. So in
Yeah.
what way would PanENtheism be different to, say, deism?
Well, so panentheism to me is this idea that God is genuinely infinite. And this is one of the things that I think many Christians don't take the omnis seriously. So omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, etc. So the notion that God is genuinely infinite in scope. Well, our universe isn't, as far as we know, as far as physics knows, our universe is unimaginably large but finite. So if you have a finite thing, it can fit inside an infinite thing and not the other way around. So God isn't in the universe is in God. And I think that's the fundamental bit of panentheism, that the notion that there is this genuinely infinite scale of a God, and then our universe, and we don't know, again, in physics, we don't know whether this is the universe or it's a multiverse or a whole variety of other possibilities. But all of that would be contained in an infinite scale God. And so, you might not even say that God created, but that God was kind of always there, and that the universe, and then I think that also fits the notion of a universe growing by a big bang and the various other things like that. So it is different. Deism is kind of the notion that God just lit the fuse and then wandered off.
Yes.
Deism is the notion that God caused the universe to exist, but then is no longer actively involved in it.
So would a panentheist say that God is almost like the forest, and in some way creates the framework in an infinite way for finite things to kind of grow and disappear within,
to exist within, a substrate for us to be,
and not necessarily created that little bush over there, but because he was the garden that was able to have grown within the physics.
There's that sort of philosophical concept, the ground of all being, like that kind of language that's used for it.
So tell us a little bit about you, where you've come from, your academic kind of journey, and then I want to spring into the Adventism and transition of some of the Adventist into how you're now viewing things. And it sounds like you, and now I kind of get. I've heard you say a couple of times. So instead of trying to quote you, but you're kind of able to still balance an Adventist kind of culture or idea within this bigger picture. It's not like you have to do away with something. You just accept a broader palette of ideas on the...
I think so. So, I mean, I started out, lived in Corumboong, went to Avondale School all the way through from grade 1 to grade 12, and then Avondale College for my teaching degree. So I was a chemistry and physics teacher, and first job was at Lilydale Adventist Academy, and then I taught for a little bit at kind of other schools around the place. Went to PNG, to Pacific Adventist College, now Pacific Adventist University, for a couple of years, and then went to Curtin University in WA to do my doctorate. And after that, went and taught in a non-denominational Christian school for a couple of years. So I'd been doing a lot of teaching, and I'd also been engaged with the creationist perspective, initially from the inside, trying really hard to reconcile creationism with the world I saw around me and the science I was trying to understand. So I came up with some very I think, ingenious at the time understandings about how you get ancient starlight if the universe is young, and all of those kind of things, which other people have talked about since, and so on. So I think over time, kind of scientifically, I challenged a recent creationism, and then sort of came to sort of think about philosophy of science, and that's been kind of something I've been thinking and writing about for probably 30 years now. So that's kind of got me to where I am on that, which is essentially that you can't rule out supernatural explanations, but you don't need supernatural explanations for the universe. Does that make sense? That we can explain everything we see around us from a naturalistic perspective.
Yes. But it still harnesses the possibility of this kind of greater than ourselves being.
Yeah, well, I mean, C.S. Lewis has a great little book called Miracles. It's only really thin, and I recommend it. And essentially, he says, a miracle is a supernatural intervention in the world. So it essentially breaks the laws of the world, but it means it's not really amenable to scientific analysis. Like, you can't analyze a miracle because it doesn't fit natural law.
Yes, it's
so
not
I'm
part
not
of the
saying
collective.
they don't occur. I'm saying I don't think I've seen any, but you can't rule them out as a thing.
Yeah, and it's like if you're doing a scientific study, you might have anomalies and exceptions to the rule, but they don't form the basis of your conclusions.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you don't evoke it. You've probably seen that great cartoon of somebody, writing an equation on the board, and then in the middle it goes, and then a miracle happens.
Yeah.
You don't invoke the supernatural as an
you don't invoke it, and you don't let it break the thread of your thought as well, I guess, other than philosophically. I've found in doing a lot of these interviews that Adventism's got a real, in a good way, a really beautiful kind of subculture that it's kind of keeps people quite cohesive in a sense of together. And when anyone does kind of rock the boat or think outside the box, there's a little bit of a, oh, hang on, what's going on? Hang on, don't rock the boat. And I think people that do initially start to question the faith, they do a little bit of what you were suggesting, that reverse engineering kind of process, where they're going, okay, well, the evidence is not really there for a young Earth, but I really want it to be right. So what if we try this other view out here? How old were you when you noticed? And I think particularly if people have a mathematical or a scientific mind and they're studying in that realm, they're going to be challenged more than someone who's raised to be an Adventist administrator or pastor, perhaps. But pastors do often challenge these things and find it really difficult because they've got nowhere to really talk about it. But for you, with your scientific background, how old were you when you started going, oh, hang on, this is not totally adding up. I want to kind of look at it in a way that I can make more sense to me.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I think I was probably in my mid-20s when I sort of thought, I want to move to a place where there are no questions that I can't ask, that I can't at least entertain and think about. And there's a thing from Aristotle that, the mark of an educated mind is being able to entertain an idea without necessarily adopting it.
Yes, I love
that. I wanted to be able to, at the very least, ask the questions, not shut them off, because I think growing up Adventist, I'd spent a lot of time just, no, cannot ask that question, even internally in my head. So moving beyond that. But I guess the other thing that I would say is that some people seem to be all in or all out, and they tend to have conversion experiences. So you talked to my good friend Peter Veach a couple of weeks ago, and I think Peter was that. He was very passionately in when he was in, and then he had a moment and he was very passionately out. Although he will say there was some transition there as well. Yeah. I think I'm the kind of person who was a bit floaty when I was in, and it was a bit floating out. So It happened very gradually over a very long period, I think, rather than that kind of, bam, I can say this was the date,
Yes. What are your thoughts on Adventism in regard to this thing we're talking about, where you kind of felt like you couldn't really even ask the questions, you couldn't even hold them in the space just to consider them, whether you believed them or not, you couldn't entertain them, like you said. it seems to me that that's a fairly unhealthy environment. Now,
Mm.
people will say, oh, well, all religions and movements and whatever are like that. Okay, well, fair enough. What if they are? It's still unhealthy.
Mm.
So let's not, I'm not going to criticize Adventism. That kind of culture, where we find that culture anywhere in the world where you're not allowed to kind of entertain ideas and discuss them, it's not healthy. What kind of things can be looked at or considered or adjusted or tweaked to create an environment within Adventism? So we're looking at Adventism. So how can we bring about some positive change where people may be less frustrated
Yeah, I think they're
with the
kind of.
restrictions?
I think there is that culture. There is this program, where people are asking the questions. There is Adventist Today website. If I can put in a small ad, I write every couple of months a little piece for the Adventist Today site, and that's a site where you can ask the questions. They will post quite orthodox things and quite outre things. I'm working on one for them right now, which is about this question of the different ways people express their religious identity. So it's relatively complicated because people will express it on a continuum or a binary, theist or atheist.
Yeah.
No, there's polytheist, there's monotheist, there is pantheist, there is, there is apatheist, person who just doesn't care about religion at all.
Yeah.
And so there's at least 3 or 4 dimensions to that thing about where people go. Sorry, I've digressed slightly.
No.
The point being
you're padding out the scene is.
The point being that I think the official GC power structure is very averse to questions and has become more so over time. The tightening up of the 28 fundamental beliefs recently around creationism and around a number of other things as well, around gender, for example. They really are sort of stamping down and saying, this is the orthodoxy, you must not challenge it. But I think there are all of these kind of fringe cultures with varying degrees of inness and outness. Your title card says looking at Adventism from the outside. So you presumably see yourself as, in some sense, outside it. I think the Adventist Today crew would see themselves as inside. And there's a huge spectrum, no pun intended. So there's Spectrum magazine at one end, and there are very conservative independent ministries at the other end, and so on. So I think it is a broad church, but not officially so.
Yeah, and that highlights a notion I've had that it's the responsibility of those that create the framework and the so-called shepherds of the flock to ensure the representation of this divergent church. And I think that perhaps, and we've just identified it at a GC level with the tightening up of the 28 fundamentals, the 6 compliance document laws that talk about gender and the earth and women's ordination, and where union leaders and division leaders must comply or they will be, warned or reprimanded. If it's their responsibility to create a healthier church, but their actions are proving to be the opposite of that, as a church, do we, like a lot of people said to me, just stay and things will change. But I've seen the opposite of change. I've seen it tightening up for over 40, 50 years. What can someone, I guess maybe from a sociological perspective, I know that's not your main field, but what would you advise people? You're a thinker, what advice would you give to a community of people when their leaders are letting them down? How can you change if the very people that are responsible for helping that change and providing that care aren't doing it? And the data suggests they haven't been doing it for a very long time.
There's been an interesting discussion on David Thiel, if I can name one of my theologian buddies, on his Facebook wall about exactly this question, about do you stay inside and try to affect change from the inside? Because presumably it's challenging to affect change from the outside. And my conclusion on that was that you stay as long as you can. At some point, staying will involve a compromise that your integrity won't accept, and you'll have to leave. But in the meantime, if you can stay, it probably is more effective to try and get change. But the World Church is a large organization, 7 odd million people. It is, for better or worse, a business. It has to function, it has to bring in money and so on. It is, interestingly, a kind of a democracy in which the global south, in which has more members but less of the resources, can dominate the votes at the GC. So there are a whole variety of reasons. I think the leadership in particular has been culpable, and we can talk about that in a minute. But I think moving that quite large ship can be challenging for all those reasons of just in the end, how do you get the votes? How do you get the delegates? How do you actually make change that way? But I think the Wilson dynasty in the leadership has been very determinedly very conservative.
Yeah,
Intentionally so, and it's tended to lead the membership in those ways. I mean, Ted Wilson's sermons at the GC that are very, very strongly intolerant of anybody with any divergent perspectives and so on. So I do think that's a challenge, and I'm not sure how that changes, because there's definitely an appetite. So there are the European conferences, and there are the North American conferences that are ordaining women. There are Australian conferences that are at least coming close to ordaining women and so on. So I think the compliance documents and so on aren't necessarily going to keep a lid on it forever. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yes.
But I don't know that I have a prescription that works because of that complexity and scale.
But at least identifying it as you have there and us talking about it creates a discussion that maybe one day people will go, oh, hang on, I got an idea that might work. And maybe it's just time. Maybe in 400 years, like for, within Catholicism or the Anglican Church, people seem to find their own little subgroups and happily coexist, under the umbrella of the mothership. But at this stage, it's probably quite a young church. But I'd then say that theologically, there's things in place in the very core of Adventism DNA that would hinder that kind of change. Within Anglicanism, for example, there's generally a back to the Bible is the source, and people go back to that, and it kind of regenerates from that. Whereas Adventism's got that 1844 component, which is always, I think, going to be a kind of a sticking point to any fast-moving change.
And Anglicanism has also undergone a schism. There's basically will ordain women and gays, won't ordain women and gays versions now. So that's another possible path for Adventism, is a split.
Yeah. And would you say they split, but they still stayed Anglicans?
Yeah, I think so. Although
kind of high church and low.
What you sometimes get then is we're the true Anglicans and those other ones are fakes. You get a bit of that going on. But,
Which in some ways, although can be annoying, is healthier than not finding a place at all within a church.
Yeah, well, if it happened, so just a really random one. Most of my research is around science education, how do we teach science better and so on. But I had a rescue supervision. So there was a PhD student whose supervisors had left the university, and he was a straight Muslim man from Malaysia who was researching gay Christian men in Australia and the way that they connected their sexuality and their religion, and how what accommodation they were able to find between their sexuality and their religion. So he interviewed a bunch of men, and then later on interviewed a bunch of lesbians as well to round out the study. And it was just fascinating because there was the full continuum. There were people who had completely rejected their religious faith because of their sexuality. They felt that they hadn't had a home in the church. And there were people at the other end who had completely rejected their sexuality, had done the conversion therapy or whatever thing, or just decided to be celibate for life, or whatever it was. And then there was a whole continuum along the middle. And a lot of the ones on the middle who'd been able to find an accommodation, it was because they found a local congregation that was welcoming to them.
Right.
And I think there are similar things in Adventism as well, where it's just kind of like if you get to a place where the church just entirely rejects you as a person and doesn't allow you to worship and to be part of it, then you'll find something. It might be another faith, it might be a moving out of faith and so on. So
Yes, that's a good point. And I think within Adventism, I know after Glacier View and the Des Ford defrocking, and how in the years post 1980 to at least 86, even up to the 90s, so many people were losing their jobs, and there was a real line in the sand. Even though there was that kind of intensity, Adventists were still finding kind of little bands of, it was almost underground. Someone, I think yesterday when I was talking to Bruce Johansson, they were talking about the cassettes that were, they'd be duplicating furiously underground. They went around the world like wildfire. And in many ways, I think the fame of Des Ford was because of that October 27 forum meeting that exploded and was recorded, and that tape literally.
I remember little cassettes arriving at home.
Yes, that's right. You'd have your little Des Ford on it or something. But what I'm saying is that created a culture that was underground, but people kind of, they knew and they'd know each other, and they'd gather in little Sabbath school rooms, and so they still found this purpose and meaning.
No, I mean, I'm a heavy metal guy, and so it has resonance for me with the underground tape trading and that as well. You discovered new bands by this underground tape trading process. So it is.
I remember even when back in the day, I think I even taught you guitar, maybe, or people in your family, and I was right into similar kinds of music as you were, and it was almost like we'd go, oh wow, we're Adventists, but we like a little bit of this, and this camaraderie you can find within something that might be dysfunctional at a bigger level. So I guess what that makes me ask is, how much push should people aim for with change if we can find our little nooks and crannies to play quietly our heavy metal albums without the rest of the suppressive body knowing? Is it that important? Is it more important to go, oh well, whatever, but I'm going to find my little group within the bigger group?
Yeah, I think particularly if you can find a little group, if it's just you being solo, that can be problematic, obviously. But if you've got a group of like-minded people that you can talk with, and I know there are particular Sabbath school classes at Avondale that are more open to questioning and comment, and have been going for 30 years at least. So there are these sort of communities where it's okay to have these conversations that you can get into, and you're very lucky if you can find one. The other thing I would say is, and I kind of just talked about the scientific side of how I got to where I am, but the other side, I think, was just zooming out and going, okay, here's Adventism, here's kind of Christianity more broadly, here's humanity more broadly. So that was a huge part, was just, and the fact that we traveled a fair bit. So we lived in Papua New Guinea, we lived in Canada for a while, we've lived in most Australian states, moving around a lot. You just kind of saw lots of different perspectives on the world. And I suddenly realized that what I'd grown up with in Corumbong all my life was not the only way of seeing the world. And, any of the varieties of that. So I didn't have to pick whether I was in or out of this one thing. It was like the world is much bigger. So, and I think maybe teaching, I currently teach in a Catholic university. I had taught in these other non-denominational Christian schools and stuff. So just zooming out a little bit from the world that I'd grown up in, I think also moved me to the place of going, well, hang on, there's really good teachings in Buddhism that I could find useful, and Hinduism and Zoroastrianism and whatever else, that the human understanding of life, the universe and everything is really broad. And so, valuing what I grew up with and what I learned, and, there's still a whole lot of scripture stuck in here from JMV's memorization, but broadening out was part of that as well. Just kind of trying to be more fully human and regard everybody else as more fully human. It was part of it. Yeah.
Part of it as well. So being able to find places where you can ask questions is healthy, but also zooming out and just looking from a bigger perspective can be healthy too. And I guess Adventism, and a lot of sects, SECTS, will try and stop people looking outside. And Adventism has, the remnant component to its belief system, and constantly not wanting people to be worldly. To a young person that, you're still young, but to a teenager and an early 20s person, what kind of advice, that's an Adventist, what kind of advice would you give them to encourage them to look outside in a bigger, zooming out way? But with the knowledge that by giving that advice, you'd be placing them in a little bit of danger. Internally, they'll feel guilty. Oh, I went to a movie. I mean, when we were kids, we would have been going, oh, I didn't go to my first movie till I was like 19, I think, maybe older. So there's a guilt component put within Adventism, and then there's the restrictions placed on it in an indoctrination style way. So advising a young person to zoom out and look at the big picture, knowing that they're going to feel guilty if they do, how would you gently kind of educate young people to do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so just a little bit of historical background first. So the James and Ellen White and all of the early Adventist leaders were radicals at the time. They were getting out of their existing churches, breaking down the orthodoxy, looking for new doctrine. Like they were radicals, and Jesus was a radical. He was challenging the orthodoxy of the time. So, I think challenging the orthodoxy is very orthodox, ironically. Yeah. So I think the fact that the church has become much more averse to that is a problem in itself. But I think part of it, what helped me was going, there are Christian solutions to some of these things. They mightn't be within Adventism, but there are Christians who accept evolution as an explanation. How do they do it? What's their rationale? What's their thinking? So going to find just a broader range of alternatives. So I think having people think it through. So it's not necessarily rejecting what they've learned, but it is saying, well, what can contribute to me? It's been really interesting being in the Catholic University, because there is this whole tradition, this Catholic intellectual tradition of Aquinas and all of these guys who had done a lot of very deep thinking over many hundreds of years about the questions that were engaging me as well. So I think kind of being fearless, doing that switch that I did and saying there are no questions you can't ask. But obviously there are questions that, what would it be like to jump off a high building without a parachute? There are questions that we don't want to act out the answers to.
Yes.
Well, we can imagine it. We can think it through and go, okay, that seems like a bad idea because,
Yeah.
But we don't shut off the thought immediately, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. So in some ways, just by creating like, for example, with yourself and what I've seen in Peter Veach too, you're, and hopefully with this show, even though we might have views that are quite different to the original Adventist view that we held as when we were younger, we're still here if people want to talk and express, and there's a safe way to do it. And I've noticed even with Peter Veach, not that he was ever harsh, but there's a softening and a kindness in his approach to people that disagree with him, and he engages with them in a way that feels very inclusive, which I think is great. And I know that you do as well. For those that would call people like you and me and Peter a bad influence, how have you been called a bad influence because you're kind of espousing kind of a broader perspective for people to look at?
Yeah, I think so.
Some Adventist leaders see that as dangerous.
Yeah, I think you do get the critiques. I guess another element, because I mean, part of the problem is, I don't want to be this special snowflake that needs my own special labels, right?
No.
Lots of people share my experience, but the PanENtheism thing it's like a useful rather than true. It's a shorthand for getting to a thing. The quantum theism thing that I chucked into the blurb as well. It's Schrodinger's cat. It's like is the waveform collapsed or not? It's a metaphor. It's a way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
I think humanism probably is the other really big piece. So I would be very happy being labelled as a humanist.
Yeah.
Someone who wants humans to flourish, basically, is what it boils down to.
Yeah.
So rather than talk about good and evil, I tend to try and talk about beneficial and harmful, because I find that simpler to understand. What actually makes life better for me and for other people and for the people I care about, and so on. And so I think, Peter and I would be the same in that way, that we would say, if someone's religious beliefs cause them to make the world a better place, we're 100% on side with them. If their religious beliefs cause them to do harm, then we're going to challenge that.
Yeah. No, I like that, and I get where you're coming from too with these labels and frameworks and settings that are useful. They're not necessarily something that you go, oh, I believe in this, I'm a panentheist, let's start a movement. It's a useful way of talking about more complex issues, and a way to refocus people on, hey, it's really about how we look after each other and not create safe environments where in the sense that's currently talked about, but in a way where people are genuinely valued and there's room to talk and move, and I've noticed that in your spaces, and I've noticed that with Peter's as well. Let's read a few things that people have been commenting and bring them up on the screen and get your thoughts. This is from Adam Gillard. PanEntheism obviously cannot be correct. God is without sin. The universe contains us who are not without sin. Our existence is upheld by God's power continually, but quite clearly we are not part of God. Adam and Peter have been having some interesting conversations in the Facebook group. By the way, if you're watching on YouTube, click subscribe for us and come and join us at Facebook, where there's lots of discussions going on. The links are all in the descriptions below. So what are your thoughts on Adam's comment there?
Yeah, so I mean, that is a really interesting one. So I think that's a comment from within a particular perspective. And this is one of the things that I've seen, in watching these shows over a few weeks, that people will make a comment very much within their own worldview. And that's fine, that's okay, but that's not a worldview that I share. So to me, that's not a definitive argument. And the use of correct and incorrect, I think, is interesting. What Adam's saying, I think, is panentheism obviously cannot be consistent with my worldview. So, part of that zooming out is recognizing that if God contains all of the universe, then God does contain good and evil, because the universe is good and evil, or as I say, beneficial and harmful. Is what is beneficial to the dolphin is harmful to the fish the dolphin's eating. So the universe does contain all of these things. And if God is greater than the universe, then God also contains these things. And God also then contains all possibilities of gender too, not just masculine and feminine, but all of the ones on other planets in other galaxies that we haven't even thought of, So I think a genuinely omni God, who is genuinely infinite, does contain all possibilities by definition. So although that rules out one of the omnis, which is omnibenevolent, a God who is only ever benevolent, only ever positive and beneficial, isn't consistent with some of the other omnis. So there's some thinking to do.
Yeah, there's some evidence to suggest that it's not always benevolent. And I'd love to have Adam on the show. We've talked about it. I've had a few private messages there. So hopefully, Adam, you will be on the program one day sharing your thoughts. I'd value hearing them here on the program. I think there's a thread through some of what Adam says, from my humble opinion, and Adam, happy for you to correct me, but it's a little bit like someone saying, like someone that loves Star Trek saying, well, Star Wars is a fantasy, and proving it from the writings of Star Trek. You can't use what you establish as your worldview to critique another person's worldview, only using the evidence found within your book.
Yeah, and I certainly noticed that with some of the questions that were asked to Peter Veach. It was like,
Yeah.
well, how do you account for the fact that the Bible says this? And Peter's going, well, that's not my frame,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's this lovely word in philosophy, incommensurability, which is just a big way of saying not measurable on the same scale. So, the scale for measuring the mass of a rock is kilograms. The scale for measuring how much my wife loves me is not kilograms. They're incommensurable. They're not measurable on the same scale.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I like it. Let's bring up a few more. Someone, who was that? Chris Wynn wrote, awesome tunes, Peter. Thank you. That was at the beginning during the 5 minutes. There's another one here which I will answer about that. Because I have just listed in the description for $1 you can buy that song. Carry Me Away was in there. So this is Hi from Shady Vista on YouTube, and he's in Arkansas. I just bought your song that was at the opening of the show. How can I listen to it? Wasn't obvious on Gumroad site. Okay, so if you go to the Gumroad site in the link and you click pay and you pay the $1, it should have a little download button. You just download, and it'll download into your iTunes or on your computer desk there. So if people are having trouble, let me know.
I don't know that there's too many more sort of content type questions up. So
I'll just give a quick little. Hang on, Modus Sapien. He's watching at 1.5 to catch up, and sorry again for starting
my
late.
students always say I talk way too fast anyway, so imagine 1.5 speed.
Someone else has written they're enjoying your thinking style. So that we'll continue on. We'll come back to some more questions later on.
Yeah, I was going to say, at the risk of kind of taking over hosting, I think we had mentioned that we would talk about postmodernism, and this conversation about frameworks seems like a sensible place to do that, does it?
Perfect. Yeah. Because in our promo we wrote, I'll just quickly read it. David has moved from Adventism to quantum theism, PanENtheism. Perhaps his relationship status with the religion it's complicated. This will be a wide-ranging conversation that might touch on science, philosophy, and postmodernism, or education and guitars and motorbikes. I like that. So let's perhaps look at some of your thoughts with postmodernism, because that is something a lot of people haven't talked about in a lot of my interviews, but it is actually very relevant. So let's hear your views on that.
So there's a real straw man that preachers sometimes say of what postmodernism is, and you hear it very, very often. And it's basically, well, we know that there is an absolute morality, and that absolute morality is guaranteed by the existence of God and God's laws and whatever. And postmodernists don't believe in that. They believe in completely subjective morality. Anyone can decide to do whatever they want, and they can go and kill people if they want and whatever. And clearly that's not what postmodernism says at all. So what does postmodernism say? There's a bunch of French philosophers who pride themselves on writing very convoluted and challenging to read things about it. But the one I really like is Lyotard, who basically says postmodernism, or the postmodern condition, because postmodernism isn't a time period, it's a way of being in the world, basically. The postmodern condition is recognizing, or is having suspicion of grand narratives. A grand narrative is a story that explains everything. So most religions try to be that grand narrative. They try to have an explanation for absolutely everything, for the universe, why it's how it is, etc., etc. But, Marxism, dialectical materialism, is also a grand narrative. It's an attempt to describe everything in terms of class struggle and so on. You could say that I don't think science is a grand narrative, but scientism, the belief that science explains everything, is a grand narrative. And Lyotard would just say, it's the zooming out thing. We come to realize that there are many competing grand narratives rather than one true one. I think, as I mentioned before, growing up in Kurrumbong, where almost everybody was either a believer or at least, understood that framework, it was pretty easy to think there was only one kind of worldview. But getting out and about in the world, you realize there are all these competing grand narratives, and you realize that they can all actually be deconstructed in terms of their own logic. If you actually think them through, none of them is completely self-consistent internally.
That's
And
interesting.
so you kind of hold belief systems loosely. So a postmodernist way of thinking is to take what's good from different frameworks. So, I think Marxism might have some useful things to say about where we find ourselves in late capitalism and the fact that the billionaires are vacuuming up all of the proceeds of our labor and leaving us poor. It doesn't mean that it explains everything. And so on. There are other narratives that are useful for explaining other things, but they're all fundamentally flawed internally. We can't necessarily adopt one. So, that's quite different, I think, from this caricature of absolute moral relativism. It also means that we can get together as groups of people and say this is what we consider to be moral behavior. We can have a age of consent for sexual behavior and an age of when you're allowed to buy alcohol, and we can have these kind of moral things that are not guaranteed and written on a table of stone, but that are created by humans being together.
And I guess being together is an important component. Humans being together need to communicate as what actions and things can we ensure happen, what behaviors to ensure the well-being of overall of that community. And I guess if you look at narratives and belief systems, ultimately they can be destructive. Like you mentioned with Marxism, yes, there's some good things, but Marxism in play in reality can be even more disastrous sometimes than billionaires ruling capitalism.
Although I would argue that they've moved out of Marxism and into totalitarianism by that time. But
Exactly, but maybe the narrative of Marxism is always going to head that way. I guess my point is that as long as a community is willing to continually say, what's the sense of well-being, and we're looking after each other as humans to let us kind of flourish. And I think sometimes that's harder to maintain, is that constant, you've got to constantly reshuffle every new generation with new conversations. In your thoughts, what's a good way, and are there communities that seem to do that well? What's a good way to do that, to keep that conversation going, saying, well, we've got 2 generations on now, there's new issues on the table, let's gather together and work out what's going to help this community flourish, and how can we get a sense of well-being and look after each other? Ultimately, is it down to leaders that are going to, or inspiring people that are going to ensure that conversation is ongoing? Because it can't really happen if it's just left to just all of us in a room having a conversation. Someone has to lead at some point in many ways. So I guess my question is, what advice would you give to communities to keep that conversation going? And secondly, have you seen any communities actually doing that?
Yeah, look, I'm really confident, comforted by the young people now. And I'm going to sound old saying the young people today, but, I think certainly of my younger friends, they are much more welcoming, much more inclusive, much more inclined to regard all other humans as humans, much less inclined to get into in-group and out-group stuff. And I want to talk about that in a minute. So, I think leadership, but not necessarily sort of hierarchical leadership, can lead us in good directions. I think also the beneficial versus harmful thing is really helpful, as opposed to the right versus wrong thing, because the right versus wrong thing can be distorted. So, it's right to oppress this person because they're not doing the right thing, No, it's not beneficial to that person. Things like Australia's asylum seeker policy, it's clearly evil. Putting people back into jails in Nauru, which is what's happening right now. So I think that notion of beneficial and harmful. But I think someone, I'm guessing that's probably Peter V, saying that a lot of our younger people are, and it's partly because we've had, I think, some good leadership, and I think we've had good trends in society and so on. There's some flailing against it. There's some bigoted views being stated loudly, but by fewer people, I think. So I think humanity is generally headed in a good direction, but then you have Mr. Putin and various other malign influences going on. I think partly, as I say, I really honestly think that it is about regarding everyone else as fully human. It's so easy to, and from every good perspective, like it's really easy for me as a kind of a lefty, kind of a liberal kind of guy to demonize the right wing, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy to do that. But recognizing that they're fully human while also opposing their policies is hard, but important. I think recognizing all of us as fully human. I think it's one of the things that Adventism, unfortunately, has been very strong on is in-group and out-group, the saved and the damned. And I think that's been harmful because it meant that you regarded, a person who has a drink of alcohol now and then as a lesser person, or a person who breaks any of the laws as somehow less fully human. And we know that leads to holocausts and such. Yeah.
Well, you wrote a good post this morning or last night on that very thing, where we need to be careful not to attack the person, name calling, shaming. We've got to keep focused on playing the ball, not the person. Avoid the ad hominem attacks. I think that's super important. Like I think, like you're saying there, it's easy to attack people on different sides of the political spectrum, but at the end of the day, we are all human, and we want to have a better place for our kids. So sometimes the rhetoric has to be softened and the content engaged more civilly. Now, another thing you said there, where in many ways the young people are in kind of good hands, there's some good leadership out there. It's interesting that within Adventism, a lot of the young people are responding to the external leadership in a positive way, not so much the internal. And I think Peter Veach has just asked a question. Do you see the SDA church headed in a good way? We kind of did touch on that earlier. Welcome, Peter. Great to have you watching. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that? We did touch on it, but let's delve into it.
It's kind of interesting. So, take the political analogy. Historically, people, at least in the past 50 years or so, people tended to be more left-wing in their youth and then turn to the right as they got older. And that kind of makes sense because you have got more resources that you want to protect, basically, as you get older. But the millennials are the first generation where that hasn't happened. They've stayed left. And by left, I mean communitarian, caring about each other rather than hierarchical. So I think there are those changes coming. And as people, currently our system in Australia is very dominated by the baby boomers. You and I are just at the very end of the boomers.
Yeah.
We try not to be part of it, but
we're baby busters, not baby boomers.
Boomers and Gen X, I think, just right on the cusp. But that's going to change. People are going to die off. And in the philosophy of science, one of the things that they say is that new theories basically happen when the old scientists retire. I think that's probably the case for the church as well. I think at the moment it's headed in a bad direction. I think this kind of increased rigidity and control is a terrible direction as an organization, but I don't think it's forever. Maybe I'm just impossibly optimistic, but I think as the younger generations come through, and also as the countries in the developing world that have those massive voting blocks also develop and change perspectives, I think there is a positive future available
for that. I perhaps don't share that, but not in a negative way. I just remember in the 80s being told, make sure you stay, Pete, and it's going to change as your generation gets into leadership. And then I remember in the 90s getting into a little bit of leadership and people above me. I remember Stephen Wold was a young pastor at the time, a bit older than me and you, and he was very much saying to me at the time, when we get into positions, I'm gonna go on and I'm gonna rise up and help bring about change as I reach different levels in the hierarchy or whatever. But he went on to start Xbox and is fully out of the church, but he did also rise up into the ranks, conference youth. I think he even got into union level, and So by the end of the 90s, I'd lost hope in that one, and then through the 2000s, and then the 2000 in the twins, is that what you call them? It just seems to me that this hope is potentially a false hope within Adventism. I'm trying to work out why, because I am a positive person and say, look, hey, I think we can bring about effective and positive change once we get into leadership. But there's something that happens within Adventism that I've seen right back in when I've studied it, right back in the first 7 years of Adventism, 1844 to 51. There's some loop that just almost brings down the hope every 7 to 10 years that just stops this change happening.
Although I think, one of the things about being real old is that you have this sort of historical perspective, and the 50s were incredibly. And this is in our society as a whole, but the church does reflect the world, even if it claims it doesn't want to. The 50s were incredibly constrained and law-bound and whatever. And then you had the 60s, the bursting of the flower children and all that kind of stuff. And I remember Adventism in the 70s, and it was the country and western hymn songbook, but it was, it was much more open, much more flexible. And, there were attempts to shut it down even then. You couldn't have a beard if you were at Avondale because beards were countercultural, Jesus beard aside. There's been that kind of trend, but it was far more open. 70s and into the 80s, I think, and that it's actually been the pendulum swung much.
But once they get into, see, I guess what I'm putting forward is that it's not a pendulum swing. There's something in Adventism DNA that I'm trying to find, that whenever there's this kind of surge forward and new leaders reach new levels where they can influence below them and bring about effective change, they don't. They become part of the problem. They either leave or they stay and shut up and just become part of the boys' network. I'm trying to work out why that is. And yes, being an old man, as you kindly reminded me, you get the chance. You get the chance. You get the chance to look back and see this loop. And normally I would see the loop, but I've seen the loops in society, in the secular realm, and people come to this position where they get into power, but they do affect change slowly. So the loop moves forward or upwards. Adventists it just loops. It just keeps on going. What is it that is so damning for those with such passion? They get into leadership role and they either become so disillusioned they leave, or they really hang on to it and go back to a more conservative view, or they just switch off and just wait till retirement. What's hidden in there?
So I think part of it is what you've identified, that people the radicals tend to leave. So that, that obviously gives you a natural selection process where, a lot of the radicalism over the years, and that happens over generations, the free thinkers tend to be selected out. So that means that the denomination is going to be a population that selects for compliance over time. I think there is a thing with the doctrines. The doctrines are very much about truth, and that comes to be quite a rigid notion of truth. So it's very attractive. Like the evangelism is about these particular, this is the truth, this is what's going on, and a certain level of conspiracy theory as well. So there's that selection as well. So I think the church selects for that. Now, often that's a generational thing. So like my grandparents became Adventists and my parents continued in it. And then I've moved out of it. My brother is still an Adventist, still preaches regularly and so on. So there are these sort of generational things where the first generation was like that, was very into the truth with a capital T, and the later generations are less so. But again, people tend to move outward. I don't know. Do you know Robert Persing, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
Yes. Oh, yes.
He's got this concept of
it's a very big book, but it's worth reading.
Yeah. He's just got this idea that there is dynamic quality, which is the radical, the new. And Jesus was that. Jesus broke down a whole bunch of the Jewish suppositions of the time and created a new thing. And I would argue that the early Adventist leaders were that as well. They were dynamic quality. And then static quality is what's meant to ratchet progress so that you don't slide back again. Static quality is this sort of conservative trend. But as you say, in general, we hope that you get progress and then you ratchet that and keep going. But it seems like in Adventism for whatever reason, and it might be something about the doctrines. It might be something about sanctuary doctrine or the various other key Adventist doctrines that you require a certain suspension of disbelief to accept.
Yeah.
And that also selects for a certain kind of person. So I don't know.
I love what you've said there. I tell you what, that last 5 minutes of what you've said, it was really, really good. Really resonates with me. A friend of mine, he's a well-known psychotherapist, psychologist, and we were just catching up maybe a year ago, and he says that a lot of Adventists go to him and have counselling and psychotherapy or whatever, and he said that he's noticed, he calls it the holding pattern, like an airplane just above it's not flying anywhere, it's not landing, it's just maintains this. And he was actually asking me, why do you think that is? So I guess that's why it's a little bit fresh in my mind. It's unlike any other movement. It just seems to, I guess Jehovah's Witnesses have a holding pattern. Mormons seem to be able to move a bit more in some ways, even though they always maintain quite a cray-cray approach, my humble opinion. There's wiggle room. Yeah, so just as we've said that, is there anything more you can add to that?
Well, I guess the other thing is there is definitely mechanisms for two things. One is, I think people sometimes stay on the edge for social reasons, but they're not passionately engaged. So that, they continue to go to church, they continue to do all the stuff, but they are not really caring about the big debates and the big ideas and so on. They're just members of a social club, essentially. And I don't necessarily judge that. I think a social club is a great thing for a person to have, but that might also lead to some inertia. The other thing is there are real mechanisms for pulling people back into line. So I would love to go back and teach at Avondale. I love my time there. I think it's a great little university now. But somebody would definitely find something that I've posted on Facebook, and I would be outed, and it would be all over, and I would lose my job. And I think that's the same for, if you're a pastor and you say something heretical and it gets recorded, then your job's on the line. You could be blackmailed, etc. So I think there are those kind of mechanisms as well, that you get good people who are passionate people, they get up into leadership positions, but then they're stuck because they have to protect the position, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. And if it was just a benign religion, I wouldn't even necessarily put my 2 cents worth in. But there's a high level of depression represented in the church ranks. I think some of the guys at the top seem to have it pretty free and easy, and they're on well-paid jobs, and they kind of have a nice engaging boys club. But a lot of people below that are constantly, like you said, if you're at even at the university, Avondale University, even there, you'd possibly lose your job unless you spoke in hushed tones in secret corners. So if it was just a benign kind of element, I wouldn't really care. But I see as an observer some dangerous sort of activities and concepts that actually bring about some serious mental health issues that can lead to even suicide, and that concerns me, and that's why I think this conversation is important. I'm certainly not coming up with any answers. I love what you're saying, though. There's some really good observations there. What is there something that can be done, or is it just, again, like we said earlier, just waiting?
No, I think, for example, it also means that people are careful. So there were I'm not going to out them by name because it's still potentially controversial, but there were a couple of lecturers at Avondale who said things to me that were benign enough, but in hindsight, they were definitely saying, hey, have another think. I was spouting a conventional orthodox line, and they just very subtly suggested, think that through a bit deeper, but they couldn't say any more than that. They felt that they were constrained by their role and so on to not be able to, which is a pity, because I think it took me a bit longer to get there than it might otherwise. If that leadership had been there.
And I guess by benign, I'm also meaning that if someone comes into the church or young people grow up in the church, there's lots of minefields there that seem a little bit more pronounced than in other movements. Again, I'm trying not to compare. So let's just imagine people come into the movement, young people growing up into the movement. There's minefields there that can cause a good amount of mental damage and spiritual abuse, I would even say. If it was benign, like, oh, so what? It doesn't really matter.
And certainly, I mean, you and I have probably had it easy as being straight guys. If you were gay or trans growing up Avondale,
Imagine,
it's a whole much more challenging world. And there's a whole variety. If you were female, for example, I mean, this is one of the issues that moved you, was kind of women's ordination. Was that we're going to suddenly treat half of the population as less.
As less than. Exactly. That's and I think I've said to you before, if I'd been a younger dad and had kids earlier in my life, I don't think I would have left. I think I'd have just shared the tension in my mind and the cognitive dissonance and just kind of enjoyed the community. And there's lots of good things about Adventism. But being an older dad and having, my young 2-year-old and watching the booing of Jan Paulsen and the suppression of women, and I thought, whoa, hang on, what's going on here? So I guess, that's what I'm talking about when I say it's not a benign church. There are some real problems there that are causing some real damage and issues. But there's also a sense of, she'll be right, mate. It's going to come good. So if we were to have a conversation of advice, then who are we to offer advice? Is there anything that pops into your mind that, if you were brought in as a consultant to the Adventist Church, but knowing the Adventist Church, that you would suggest to the church that they shift and change on different areas?
Yeah, I think, I do tend to be Pollyanna. I do tend to be very optimistic, because the alternative is just despair. And
despair and
despair,
And I'm not trying to be negative. I'm actually like that too. I'm positive, and I actually enjoy my current connection with Adventism. And
I think, I mean, to be honest, what I would advise is actually like go back to Aristotle, go back to the possibility of entertaining an idea without necessarily adopting it. Just allow people to ask the question and have the conversation, and allow people to adopt different positions. If you can be Adventist and be employed by the organization or in a leadership position, and I just remembered another short thing that I will mention in a second. But if you could say, well, I don't find the evidence for a recent Earth and a special creation convincing. I believe that this universe has been here for a long time, and that life in it has arisen over a long time by largely natural processes, possibly with supernatural intervention here and there. If you could say all that and still be, principal at Avondale, or pastor of a church or whatever, it would be a healthier organization. If you could be a trans person and be in church and be loved and accepted and included, and so on and so on. I think being more radically inclusive. Actually, Peter V did ask a question in the discussion, which was about, I said Jesus was a radical. And he pulled me up, as Peter often does, about saying, well, hang on, when you say Jesus was, who do you mean? Are you taking the existence of the historical Jesus as represented in the Gospels as being a real thing? In a way, I don't think it matters. I think there probably was a real Jesus, and I think that he probably did say many of the things that the Gospels report him saying, and do many of the things the Gospels report him doing. But the Gospels were written sometime after he died, from verbal accounts from people and so on. And I think there are later interpolations. I think there are things that people have added to what he was purported to have said that don't really fit with the rest. So, but I think that character, and this is probably going to sound heretical to people, but that character, the Jesus as represented in the Gospels, is a person who makes the world better, He accepts the woman caught in adultery when everybody else wants to stone her. He challenges the hypocrites and the powerful. He afflicts the comfortable and comforts the afflicted. He challenges the Zacchaeus, the tax collector, for taking too much of the wealth. He was, yeah. So as I say, to me, I don't care that much if it's a real historical persona, and if it is a real historical person, if it's the Son of God. I don't know that, to me, for what I'm taking from it, those questions aren't so important. What I'm taking from it is advice for ways to be in the world. And from the rest of the Bible as well, from the Proverbs. There are lots of really practical Proverbs. If you bless your neighbor loudly early in the morning, it will be taken as a curse. There's lots of really basic stuff like that. So there's lots of good stuff in the Bible. There's some bad stuff as well. So I take from that what I can, and then I take from other wisdom traditions and wisdom literatures around the world what I can as well.
Yeah. No, well said. Peter has also asked another question here, which I thought was a good one. What's the best and worst thing about the SDA Church in your view?
I think the best thing is community, but that's common to many other things as well. So getting a bunch of people together, and ideally getting a bunch of all ages together. On one hand, in the worship music wars, it was nice to have the youth tent at Big Camp where you could get your own music a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think that actual all-inclusiveness, but it historically ended up being, everybody is sitting in straight rows listening to a white straight man of a certain age talk. That was kind of how it was. So it was inclusive of everybody, but not everybody's voice got shared.
Yeah.
So I think there's ways to move on that. But I think, a community is a really good thing to have. And I think our modern society struggles a bit because people don't have community. They have their online life, which is a different thing, but they don't necessarily have humans around them who just care about them as people for themselves. So as that can be, doesn't need to be the SDA church or any church. It can be a bowls club, it can be whatever your social circle is. But I think that's a really good and valuable thing. And I think we lose that to our peril. The worst thing is compulsion and orthodoxy that is harmful. As we've said, it can lead to suicide. It can lead to people being miserable for years. It can support and hide and move on child abusers. It can give tacit support to spousal abusers and so on. I think that what you end up getting is the worst elements of the patriarchy supported by religion. And I think, again, that's not unique to Adventism particularly, but I think as a kind of a more conservative Christian trait, it can end up in that place. So those would be my two, I think. So
Yeah, so the bad thing is the compulsion it seems to put on people, but the good thing is the community. And like I said, you can find that elsewhere, but when you're born into something and you grow up in something, it has its own unique specialness to it.
Yeah, and I tend to hang out with Adventist groups. I'm very happy to show up at church at Avondale when I'm there and so on. I don't feel that, I'm going to burst into flames when I walk in the door or whatever. But also I hang with a lot of ex-Adventists who kind of quite strongly identify as ex-Adventists.
Yes.
I don't really, I am much more of I'm a person in the world. That's my background. It's formed who I am, but I don't identify myself in opposition to that background kind of thing.
No, I get that. And I think there might be a similarity between you and I, because I've often said that as well. And you had a real passion for heavy metal music, and I had a passion for blues and rock music. At a young age, that kind of releases you into another community. So I've never felt that to my core I was an Adventist. I felt to my core I was a human and a musician and loved a whole other culture, but I was wearing an Adventist jacket. So when I took it off, the real me was still there.
The core was still there,
It wasn't in my blood, so to speak, even though I was fifth generation.
Yeah.
Can I go back to something else, or two quick things? It's interesting at the moment. There's and rightly so, huge opposition to the patriarchy. The irony there is that the patriarchy that eventually became the one that's in power now was also the patriarchy that was responsible for bringing an end to slavery and bringing in women's vote and bringing a more aiming for equality and creating a space where people could rise up and speak. Is there a concern that there's a bit of a turn on the average white middle-aged guy who was a part of the process to bring about this positive change, though privileged, but we're kind of not realizing that part of growing from one bad thing into a good thing had to kind of have been done by those very white leaders. I'm just posing that to you because I like the way you think. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think, to me, the fact that there is toxic masculinity, and we can talk about toxic masculinity, doesn't mean all masculinity is toxic.
No. But I'm meaning even a bigger picture to that. Like patriarchy, old patriarchy, new, always been toxic people, men and women. There's a unique kind of masculine toxicity, but the general progress of the Western civilization has been to reinterpret itself in a good way.
Yeah,
but if you
I think we can challenge that. Sorry, we can challenge the notion that, yes, I guess men in particular had to lead it because they were the only people who were allowed to touch the reins. So who knows where we would have been if we had women leaders. I mean, we certainly did. We had, Boudica we had various, we had Cleopatra, 3,500 years ago. We had powerful female leaders. There are tribes that have matriarchies and so on. So, I think it's being tried. But yeah, you could argue that a lot of that kind of Western progress was built on the back of colonialism and resource extraction from the rest of the world and so on.
But there were lots of colonies, though. There was Portuguese, Spanish, Arabic, even in Africa.
I think they were probably all patriarchal, though, most of the colonizers. So,
But the Western civilization is the only civilization that has gone, hang on, let's bring about a change. I'm not making any claims. It's just while I've got you, I'm going, I want to see what you think about this. Is there it felt to me growing up, yes, privileged, all of the negative stuff associated, but I was also aware that those in power were handing the reins over and realizing their fault, their guilt, their heritage. But now it seems like there's a bit of a swing to the other side where if it only white colonialists brought about evil into the world. I think it's a bit bigger than that, and maybe we shoot ourselves in the foot.
Well, this is part of the suspicion of grand narratives, right? This comes back to postmodernism. There were many black slavers in Africa who took slaves from other tribes and so on. So, any overly simplistic account of history is overly simplistic. That history is always more complicated than we think it is. I think, for us, we happen to have a particular microphone literally because of who we are. So we are kind of having this conversation, and we hope it's a helpful conversation. I hope that, although I am a very sort of cis straight guy, that I can be helpful to my gay and trans friends in making a space for them where they don't get a chance to speak. The ideal is that they get to speak.
That's right. But because you might have a certain privilege, you might be able to forge the way and say, hey, come on in, let's do it together. I'm just a bit concerned, and who knows, don't even think of what I say, don't take it with any weight, but I feel like there's a bit of a leaning, maybe I'm looking at something coming in the future. I tend to look over the hill and what's happening now, to go, right, thanks for forging a way and letting me come in, but now let me kill you and I will forge the way myself. there's a little bit of that seeming to come through society.
There is certainly, there's always one of my most common concepts is that everything's on a bell curve, and most things are about humans. So there are people who are very strongly one way, people very strongly the other way, but there aren't very many of them, and most of us are somewhere in the middle on most issues. So there are radical feminists who are, separatists, that let's go off and make an island of all women kind of thing. But I think those voices are sometimes loud, but not very influential.
Yes, good.
And I think a lot of the conversation of white men saying that they're being discriminated against is just losing the privilege. It's just I be able to say whatever I want, and now I have to be a bit more careful about my words. That kind of thing. So,
and I like what you've said there. Sometimes on both sides, left and right. On social media, you're only hearing the loud voices.
Yeah, exactly. You're hearing into the bell curve. Yeah.
A friend of mine worked in a radiography, I think it was, or he was a radiologist, and he said he got to the point where he thought everybody had cancer because that's who he's seeing every day. So we've got to be careful with, as we listen to a lot of or watch what's on social media, we've got to remember that it may not be the rational thoughts we're hearing, but more the spikes on both sides.
Yeah. Well, the old joke is medical students' disease is you read the textbook and you think you've got all the conditions. Psychologist students' disease is you read the textbook and you think all your friends have got the conditions.
That is very true. That is very true. Yeah. One quick thing, and then we'll go to some interesting comments in the questions. We were mentioning before that the millennials seem to be the only generation that maintain the liberal focus. Was that because they had it a bit easier and kind of the credit card generation that many of them are still living at home with mum?
A little bit, although they also have it a lot harder. I think, I'm at the risk of sounding immodest, a relatively smart kid from a relatively poor background. Both my parents worked in the food factory at Currumbong. So we did okay, but we were not wealthy. But I was able to, because university fees were subsidised, because a house only cost about 4 years of salary rather than 8 years of salary as it does now, et cetera, to get ahead and be pretty comfortable. I would hate to be me starting now.
Yes.
For the Zoomers, the Generation Z, it is much tougher. The material conditions, they have to come. My students at uni are really struggling because they have to work a full-time job and study full-time because they can't put bread on the table or pay rent otherwise, and so on. Yeah. So I think that's part of it.
I think it's harder for that upcoming generation than the millennials. I think the millennials had it pretty easy. Yeah,
and I think it's obviously that's been a continuous trend, and that's since Thatcher and Reagan in the 80s, really, the neoliberal turn. But they are now seeing, hey, my life absolutely sucks, and the billionaires literally doubled their wealth during the pandemic. There's something wrong with this. So, I think that's probably why there's this change, is that people are kind of going, well, no, our society is manifestly unfair. Let's do something about it. Whereas in Australia, at least, the negative gearing policies and the capital gains discount means that a lot of people our age are very comfortable because the playing field's been tilted, and now it's really hard for a young couple to get it. All of that stuff.
Yeah, very true. But I encourage the Zoomers and the young'uns to hang in there. There's still great opportunities. Just persist, look, dig.
Yeah,
I love that. Again, that last little few minutes there, some really good thoughts. Thank you for sharing those. Went off track a little bit, but I know that you think a lot about this stuff, and I appreciate your insights there. I'm just going to bring up a couple of things. I think Ken Ramey has posted 2 thoughts. The religious impulse has always been based on superstition. Fear is at its root. Fear of the unknown, fear of defeat, fear of death. And then he's added, when I was in SDA church school in the 70s, the time of trouble caused tremendous anxiety. Can anyone relate? I think that's probably a general question, but did you have that?
Yeah, absolutely.
You and I in the 70s, there was lots of that going on.
Yeah, no, I was scouting the caves in the Wadigans and
Me
thinking about
too.
putting cases of nut meat in them. Yeah, no, it really was a thing,
Yeah.
and I think certainly a lot of the modern church, again, not just Adventism but Christianity, a lot of the Pentecostal churches are very sort of fear based. Bust out one of those memorized scriptures. God didn't give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. That's a good one.
Mm.
I think the things that are motivated by fear are very good if you're a church leader who wants to make money out of someone. But they're also a very good way of separating people, of making people fear the other. I'm again terrified for my trans friends in America because this sort of whole grooming and sort of demonization of trans people, they're going to start getting killed. We're going to be back to gay bashing days because there is just this approach of fear, and it's unfortunately it's tied up with religion. So I don't necessarily agree with Ken that religion is necessarily sort of superstition and fear, but it can be taken that direction. But again, so can anything. Marxism can be taken that direction, and that's when you get Pol Pot effectively. You get Cambodia and the killing fields when you get this sort of philosophy of fear. I think, as I say, I think it's a fair comment that religion can be and has been used in those ways, but I don't think it's inevitable.
No. And in some ways, this, as new leaders and influencers arise, there's a responsibility there to actually care and offer pastoral care to ensure that kind of leadership that is oppressive doesn't take root so firmly. You mentioned that your brother, he's still in the church. He's probably more on the conservative side. You've gone more willing to entertain a broader spectrum of ideas. How does that unfold? And don't have to answer this, but how does that unfold when you're both breaking bread together at the family dinner table at family gatherings?
Well, I mean, it's even closer than that because my wife would still consider herself to be an Adventist.
Okay.
She doesn't regularly go to church, but she believes and believes strongly. So I think, we've kind of found a modus vivendi, a way of living together, where we emphasize what we share. And we do kind of share that humanism. From her, it's a Christian perspective. She's a marriage counselor, so she's talking to people all the time. And she doesn't do that in an explicitly Christian way. She does that in a kind of a therapy type way. But her underlying thing is love is of God, God is love, and selfishness is of Satan. So it really is a choice between love and selfishness. And I would agree. I would probably put more of a political spin on that, but it really is kind of concern for one another versus selfishness is the values of the world. And so I think, emphasizing the positives and then being good-humored about the differences. So we go to the zoo and the sign says, the tiger was from 3.2 million years ago or whatever it is, and she says, oh no, it's only 6 to 10,000 years.
Okay, interesting.
And I sort of say, well, I think the evidence might suggest, but there's no malice in it. I think
that would make for some interesting conversations. And you'd have those with your brother as well.
I think so. He's a very, very good and deep thinker. Very proud of him. He preaches excellent sermons that are very challenging and well thought through and puts a huge amount of work into them and so on. He's working for Sanitarium at the moment doing health promotion stuff rather than pastoring stuff.
Right.
We do have those open conversations and
is he at the conference office still in North New South Wales?
No. So
he was there, wasn't he?
He was. Yep.
So just using David Geelan, Paul Geelan as a little icon, like not just the metaphors. Why would it be, in your opinion, that it's the David Geelans are happy to come on my show, which speaks to a very broad Adventist audience, very diverse audience, watchers, but the Paul Geelans are very reticent to. Now, I've never asked Paul, so I'm literally talking about this.
Yeah, that type of person. Yeah, I mean, part of it is just that I'm, a bit of a narcissist or whatever. Yeah, I don't fear the exposure. So, but and part of that is the job. I work for. Well, I've mostly worked for secular universities, so I've had this freedom to speak and not fear losing my job. I can basically say whatever I want as long as I don't criticize my employer in my current job. But I was a little bit careful about what I said about Cardinal Pell's funeral, for example, in my social media presence, just aware of the job pressure. So there's some of that for sure. There's that, fear of losing your job or fear of being ostracized from your group. Well, I'm kind of not in that group. I'm in a huge range of varied groups. So yeah, the Facebook thing is everybody from motorbike people to music people to cyberpunk science fiction people to people I've worked with at university. It's an incredibly diverse thing. So I think that's helpful to have a diverse group of friends. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, but we're different people because I always was incredibly slack and got the grades that would get me what I wanted, nothing else. And he always worked his guts out and got the highest grades in the class and all that kind of, there's just innate differences in people as well.
Yeah. There seems to be a trend, though. If you're a little bit more liberal, progressive, you're more inclined to come on I'm just talking about my show. You're more inclined to go, oh, yeah, I'll come and speak on that. If you're a little bit more conservative, there's a bit more caution. And it's not just because they're worried of how I will talk to them, because I'm very open to anyone being on the program. But there just seems to be, like Peter Veitch and Adam Gillard, they've had lots of conversation online. I'm able to get Peter on the program. Adam, you're a bit harder to get on the show. That's probably my fault because I've not been so good at replying messages lately. But yeah, there's just a bit of a trend there, maybe.
Retired people as well, though. So David Thiel, I really enjoyed his one.
There's
a number of those. A number of the people you talk to just because of when the 70s were and when we are now are retired people, so they probably have less of that job fear as well.
Right.
I think that's part of it. And even if you don't fear actively losing your job, you fear it being awkward or difficult or whatever.
But I guess someone like Adam or your brother, they do toe a more Adventist kind of line. So there's no fear of them losing their job being on my show, but they're still less likely to come on. I'm just trying to work out why that might be. I've got a bit of a blind spot there.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is it they're worried that I'm seen as a bit of a dissident? You don't want to be associated with a dissident, or
maybe it's a guilt by association rather than
yeah.
Okay. I mean, you would hope that it is about actually just getting your perspective out there, because I think
There's another guy, sorry for interrupting, but he was writing to you, I've just got a mental blank, on your promo shot. I'll just bring it up. I can't find it. Oh, no, here we go. I'll just raise it because you and he were having a good chat. Courtney Edwards. And Courtney, I think you're watching today. Thank you for watching. And I do enjoy the conversations that he has or you have with him and others. And I don't feel guilty by association. Is that the word? Not guilt. Whatever the word is. But yeah, I'd like to have more people like that on the show to confirm to those watching that it's okay, that it's not something I'm going to be bashing them or challenging them in a way that's I'd challenge you the same way.
I don't know if you know, Tom Ballard, the comedian, has a podcast, and he will have everybody on. He's had people on from One Nation and so on, although that's not his thing. It really is just having a conversation and letting people share their ideas. So
yeah. Okay, well, we'll so just the little the takeaway from that is, if you are watching and you're from a more conservative Adventist, have that kind of a position, love you onto the show. I'd love more of you guys on the program. Now, this is from YouTube, Moto Sapien. Great discussion as usual with the pantheistic view. And by the way, Moto Sapien, I know you joined later. It's PanENtheist, which is slightly different. Do you consider yourself Christian? Personally, I couldn't reconcile the Bible and pantheism or PanENtheism, it would be the same. From John 1, God created all and not is all, and is not in all. But yeah, we've established that's a little bit of a different view that you have, but generally speaking, it's relating. Is that you can share
that God contains all, I guess, is another way of putting it. But no, I don't think I would necessarily identify as Christian. I would identify as, actually, no, I wouldn't identify as a member of the Christian church, but I would identify as a follower of Christ. As I was saying before, that the person portrayed in the Gospels is someone who I see as very worthwhile to follow. And as I say, very radical, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. They trip off our tongue now, but they're radical. Literally, if someone slaps you, don't slap back.
Yes.
Give them another go. That's radical,
Yeah. And as you and I have talked about, and you even did a program for me on my Voice Life Fellowship group, which it encourages the presenter to only talk about the four Gospels, and you were able to really share a really great talk there on the teachings of Jesus, and that's the kind of Jesus you're teasing out of this conversation.
Exactly. There's another great one, I think, from Motor Sapien.
Is it this one?
Yeah, perfect.
As I've said about most of your guests who were born on the Adventist bus and left, they've been beat over the head with a wrong view of it. I was too, but when I read for myself, I found a view I liked. I'm guessing within Adventism. What are your thoughts on that? There is a kind of Adventism that I've often talked about within Adventism that doesn't get the light of day I think it deserves.
Yeah, no, I think it sounds like our mate has managed to find a place on the bus that he's comfortable with. And that's great. I think, as we were talking about before, I think it is actually a broad church. I think there are actually a huge number of just Adventist perspectives. And some of them, I have no problem with. That they are humane. They are, they do lead to human flourishing, and that's great. And I'm really pleased that he's been able to find it. The other thing I would say is I'm not sure whether Moto Sapien means motorbikes, but I think we did also promise motorbikes, didn't we? So.
Yes, while we're on the topic, share us your views on motorbikes. I've got two friends about to go on in a couple of months' time, a bit of a road trip, and they want me to go along as well. I'd have to get my bike license, but when I was young, I loved motorbikes. So let's talk about motorbikes.
And
Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance.
That's it. Currumbung was a great place to grow up, and I did that thing that you see still these days of pushing the dirt bike along the side of the road till you get to the place where you can legally ride it. Did a lot of that with very, very cheap and ancient motorbikes. I had a 50cc Bombardier, very, very rare and weird. It was a two-stroke, and you could roll it backward down a hill and the engine would start running backward. So you could ride it around in reverse for a little while to run out of fuel. So it was a very weird machine. So right since then, I've kind of had bikes, and then I had a bit of a hiatus when the kids were small, just for their own safety and so on. And then came back to it when we came back to Australia from Canada, and have had a 250 and then a 400 and then a 1200, and now I have a Ninja 1000, which goes plenty fast enough to get me into trouble. Occasionally take it to the racetrack, which is a lot of fun because there's no cars to get in the way. So it's one of the things I love. Susie, my wife, also has a bike. She has the 400 baby version of the one that I've got, and we ride together. We rode up to Cairns together from Brisbane over about a week or so and back. So it's one of those things that brings joy. And as I say, I think it's one of the, as you said about music identity, I've kind of got bike identity as well. So you've got these multiple identities that you have. And you can harness and have a variety of views and lifestyles and still engage in things that are more serious as well. So you'd recommend I go on the little mini road trip with these guys? I think so. Get something for about 3 or 4 weeks. Is it hard? The only thing that throws me off is because I can hire a bike, but is it hard to get the license? No, not super. It's expensive these days. It's about $500 for the bit, but it's not too crazy. Although I know the Queensland rules better than the New South Wales rules, so you'd have to look into it. But yeah.
Okay. And Motor Sapien replied, "Yep, it's motorcycle road racing."
Very nice. Okay, yeah, no, I haven't raced, but I've done lots of track days, so yeah.
And Ken Ramey has written, I think Tim Minchin is my favourite Australian. AC/DC are cool also. We'd probably both agree with that too.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a Tasmanian death metal band called Psychroptic that's pretty good as well. But
I haven't heard of them. Tasmanian band. What? How do you spell it?
Psychroptic. PSYCROPTIC.
Oh, go check them out.
And yeah, they're great. They're very death metal, but very fluid and sinuous and roundy.
Oh, you have to send me some links after so I don't forget. And Ken has written, again, never been to Australia. It seems fascinating, though. Such a huge landmass, but less than 30 million people. Yeah.
Yeah, that's about right.
It's interesting, I was looking at the stats of SDAQ&A the other day, and we have way more viewers from the US than Australia, which surprises me.
Excellent. Hola, Americanos.
Yes, it's really good, growing really fast too. I think this is Peter Veach has written, "I like the view of live happily forever after. I simply don't believe it's true." Here's another one from Ken. Thanks for all your comments today, Ken. Faith is irrational. Agree? I often say to people, well, faith can be used to defend any belief. So therefore, it does appear to be a bit irrational. And then people will define it. But what they're really defining to me is more confidence in previously proven outcomes.
I wrote one to Adventist Today a while ago called Faith and Motorcycle Tires while we're on the topic, which was essentially, yes, I have faith that my tires will hang on while I go around a corner hard and fast. If I didn't have faith, I would be paralyzed. I wouldn't be able to go around corners at all. Right? I have to believe that that's the case.
But you believe it not on no evidence.
No. So that faith is grounded in a number of things, including experience, including the fact that there are safety standards for such things. There's a variety of things that support that.
So would you use the word confidence instead of faith?
Well, I don't know, because I don't think it's fair to let the religious people steal faith to mean only belief. Faith can be defined, I guess, as belief in the absence of evidence or in the face of contrary evidence, which is sometimes a thing as well. But I think that's too narrow a use of faith.
But it's often the word they wheel out when they want to not go deeper and say, well, I can't explain it. I've got no evidence, but I have faith. So in the context of how they use it, we have to kind of answer it to their definition.
So I think so. So, and when it's used that way. Sorry?
Yeah. So when used that way, is Ken right?
Yeah. It's irrational in a, not a pejorative sense, but a technical sense. It's because reason basically works by having your premises and your conclusions and your logic and tying them together. And it's irrational in the sense that you can put in literally any value for A and it still works. You said, you can basically support anything. But, so there are things that are not. So I'm confident that my wife loves me, because there's evidence to relate to it, but it's not empirical evidence. I can't measure it. I can't weigh it.
You can measure it in the sense that in the last 100 days, she said that you love.
Yeah, exactly. That she's said it and she's done things that show it, and so on and so on. Yeah. So, but I think religious people would say, well, yes, and God has looked after me in the last 100 days and made sure that I had the food and everything that I needed.
There's no evidence they can show to anyone else, whereas you can actually show data from your wife's. And I think that's the only thing that I find an interesting topic, because I find it that when the Christian uses the word faith, it's always kind of the last thing when they go, look, you've been browbeating me so much. This is it. But to me, it's a bit of a cop-out. Moto Sapien has just written, to clarify on faith, the Greek is pistis, which is often translated to trust, believe, faith, and confidence. It's not a blind trust, it's tested and proven, which again, so that's, I think you're right. I think people are misusing the word faith, and I think they've redefined it, and it's good to claim it back for what it really does mean. But as Modo Sapiens says, it is a total cop-out answer when used the way they are saying. There is no data I can present to you or show to anyone else other than what I feel internally. So we're stopping this because faith has some kind of carries a certain amount of respected weight.
Well, yeah, and that's how you get to Scientology and Xenu and his 7 million aliens or 7 billion aliens in a volcano. Basically the evidence for believing that is faith. Essentially, it's in a particular text. It's in the book L. Ron Hubbard wrote.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah,
because a lot of people draw on that word faith. Mormons use faith. Huge. They're huge. They just left. I feel it in my heart. That's confirmed. Ken has written, could religious belief basically reduce to a coping mechanism in a rather terrifying world?
Interesting to think about. I should mention my other buddy, Ron Lawson. So Ron Lawson is a sociologist of religion. Born in Australia, lives in the United States.
Had a couple of really good interviews with him down here somewhere.
And he's a really, really great thinker. And one of the things that I learned from him is that the sociology suggests that where the conditions of life are more uncertain, people are more religious. So that kind of plays into Ken's question. That and it's one of the reasons, interestingly, that America is quite religious despite being quite wealthy, because there's such high levels of inequality. So for some people, the conditions of life are very secure and comfortable. But for a lot of people, particularly in the South, life is precarious and they tend to be highly religious. So that correlation seems to hold for people around the world.
And more conservative politically as well?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. That it is, searching for certainty in an uncertain world. If you are very secure in your material conditions, if you know that you've got a house, you can pay your rent or pay your mortgage, you've got a car, you've got food, you know that you're going to be fine, you're probably less inclined to be, although, politically, the revolutionaries also arose from that. So the Russian Revolution and the South American revolutions arose from people whose conditions were insecure and decided to do something about it. So maybe not only conservative, but yeah. So I think so, but kind of saying reduced to a coping mechanism. I don't know. I think it's a meaning-making story, but I don't think we should necessarily denigrate a meaning-making story. I think we all have a meaning-making story.
Yeah,
we all have a myth that we live by, and mine really probably is that humanism. It's that people are good and can be better, and that's maybe not in evidence. There's a lot of people being awful around the world, But it is a meaning-making story that makes sense to me and helps me to do the things I want to do in the world, So religion may be one among many, and it may be politics. It may be. I think a lot of people don't have one. A lot of people watch Married at First Sight. Let the TV tell them what they want to watch and do, and don't really kind of have that at all. And maybe that's a problem in itself as well.
I get annoyed when people say, "Oh, come on, stop! You guys still talking about this stuff? Come on, just live your life." When I think I do live my life, I have a great life, and I do this. Hey, I'd love to have you on the show regularly, like every couple of months, because I love the way we get to kind of both talk about this thing that we obviously genuinely care about, this Adventist movement. We're still very involved with having friendships within it, and we respect the structure, like to give a bit of a stir of the pot, but mainly to try and help bring about positive change, generally speaking, within the human context. So I don't know if you'd be up for that, but I'm inviting you in public. But I think Adventist, each week, there's something interesting happening. It'd be great every couple of months just to go, hey, what's been going on? Let's have a little look at it. If you were interested.
I think that's been one of the things today, is because there was so much we could have talked about that we've kind of gone everywhere. Which I don't think is a problem, but it might be fun to have a more focused.
We could have a every couple of months, or 6 weeks or so, because because I've got so many guests. I'm thinking of opening up a few extra days, but again, that takes a little bit of extra time out of my earning capacity in the world. But there's lots of current events that keep occurring that I'd love to just unpack. And even if it was a shorter show, we could do like a 1 hour, one topic. Let's unpack it. So let's do that. Let's ponder that. And if you think of something, because you're on the cutting edge there with AT as well, they've certainly got some. I've got Steve Ferguson coming on to talk about that recent article he wrote about Ellen White and vinegar. So that's going to be an interesting one. Yeah, so look, let's do that. I think that'd be exciting. And I think we might leave it there. There is one long comment. Oh, Adam Gillard's written. I'll bring it up because
it's one we've seen before, though, I think.
Oh, okay. He's written. I can't see my post. Just go filter through. I may as well make it. Yeah, no, we did address it, Adam, and we talked about you and would love you on the show. So, Adam, you might have been booted off, but if you go back, it's somewhere in there.
Yeah, in the YouTube, it'll be definitely in the conversation. You'll see it come up. So, yeah, we did chat about it.
Now, sadly, the YouTube doesn't keep the comments made during the program. No. That's why I try and bring all the YouTube ones up here. But Adam's in the group. Watch it again on Facebook. It's in there somewhere. If I get a chance, I'll try and find it and give you a number where we chatted about it.
I'm very happy to continue the conversation on Facebook as well.
Yes, and it was a good question, Adam. Thank you. So, yeah, let's do that. Any closing thoughts? We've had a great audience today, by the way. Thank you, everyone, for watching, even though I was delayed by an hour and 15 minutes. You guys hung in there, and we've had a really good number watching, so thank you. Any closing thoughts there, David, until next time?
Yeah, no, I think just thanks to everybody, because it's been a really interesting conversation. And I think, yeah, as you say, I would love to have more interesting conversations. Always fun. It means that I get to rabbit on about all of these things that have been going around in my head, and I haven't necessarily had a context to share. So, yeah.
I've definitely asked some things today that I've never said out loud, just because I'm interested in your thoughts. Oh, awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor David Geelan, for joining us here on SDAQ&A, and we'll be back next week. I'm trying to have an interview with John Den, Norm Young, and Russell Schultz about can SDAs actually call themselves Protestants. So that's going to be a really interesting discussion. We're trying for next week for that. Brian Patterson, I know you're watching right now. I'd love to have you on as well. Steve Ferguson's coming up. Gillian Ford is just about to release the fourth volume and is going to be working on a fifth one on letters to and from Des. So that's brilliant as well. Lots of things coming up. Until next time, we'll see you guys later.